Thank you for attending this webinar on the Cybersecurity Capability and Maturity Model, generally known as C2M2. This is the first webinar in our second set of webinars, and I'm very proud and grateful for the fact that we had over 500 attendees from 55 countries during our first webinar series. I'm Johanna Kollmans-Weinen, Senior Program Coordinator at the U.S. Energy Association, and I work on the Energy Utility Partnership Program, of which this is a part. Please note this webinar is being recorded and all participants are muted with their video turned off. You're welcome and encouraged to post questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, and my colleague Jake Swanson and I will be monitoring them and passing them on to our presenters as appropriate. Generally, we'll be waiting with holding the questions until the end of the seminar unless you're referring to a particular slide. Today, our presenters will lead us into the critically important discussion on the benefits of digitalization of, I have the wrong notes here, sorry. This is on the C2M2, the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model. And I will next be introducing our USAID partners and then our speakers. So the U.S. Energy Association is a nonprofit membership association of public and private energy-related organizations, corporations, and government agencies. And we represent the broad interests of the U.S. energy sector by increasing understanding of energy issues, both domestically and internationally, through capacity building activities and events like this one. This series of webinars is financed through our cooperative agreement with USAID, the Energy Utility Partnership Program, as I mentioned earlier, and in particular through USAID's Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, known as EPRI. So today, presenters from the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, and Southern Company will walk the audience through the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and link it with the C2M2 framework. In addition, the webinar will cover EPRI's Technical Assessment Methodology, TAM. And with this, I will hand the floor over to Kristen Madler.
Thank you, Johanna. My name is Kristen Madler. I work in USAID's Global Energy Division. And following this webinar series featuring US and international digitalization and cybersecurity experts, USAID's Global Energy Division will launch a new business innovation partnership program. And as utilities around the world are facing profound changes driven by new technology, increased competition, and market reform, the Business Innovation Partnership Program will support partner utilities' ability to adapt to innovations in technology, increasing customer expectations, changing government oversight, and changes in their business model due to competition and business process improvements. The program will entail 3 components: change management, certification, and coaching, building technical leadership capacity, and advancing innovation efforts. So effective change leaders anticipate where things are moving, facilitate the implementation of change, and sustain momentum by taking charge and moving things ahead. So the utility of the future must be both proactive and reactive to overcome organizational inertia, examine strategies for overcoming individual resistance to change. Through this program, participants will learn through other utility executives that have successfully implemented change management strategies, and they'll understand how effective change improves organizational results. This cohort of utilities will collaborate with energy sector executives, leading utility innovation teams that contribute to accelerating the sector's transformation. The program will also facilitate connections between partner utilities and the world's most promising energy startup companies through accelerator and incubator programs to strengthen cooperation in advancing innovation efforts. And this business innovation partnership will build on this initial webinar series by inviting select utilities to participate in a high-level workshop on innovation and change management, and nominate employees to join a more formal one-year program with an emphasis on utility change management and innovation. And the selection of this first cohort of business innovation partnership utilities will be based on a combination of factors, which include senior leadership interest in adopting change management principles and practices to build a culture of innovation, and motivation to develop new business models and pilot projects. So that's a big picture of where we are headed, but next I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Jamila Amadeo, to provide context on the upcoming webinar series.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Johanna. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants. Welcome to our Digitalization and Cybersecurity webinar series. I'm Jamila Amadeo, Senior Energy Advisor with the Energy Division of USAID, and I work with Kristen, Johanna, and Jake on the Business Innovation Partnership. I hope everybody had a good summer and is doing well during these COVID-19 times. Due to the pandemic, many of us are working from home and relying on our remote systems, teleworking. However, you probably also saw a lot of news that this has been a summer of increased cyber attacks worldwide. I want to share with you a slide from NetScout. Johanna, if we can advance the slide, that shows that starting in April, there was a steady increase in the number of denial of service attacks on utilities worldwide. In July of this year, the number of attacks increased more than 8 times compared to the same month, July of last year. We believe our webinars are timely, and our partner organizations throughout the world can take advantage of the top cyber experts presenting with us on the latest developments, resources, and tools develop cybersecurity in the energy sector. Today, we have 2 leading experts from the Electric Power Research Institute and Southern Company who will walk us through the most practical electricity sector utility assessment methodologies, focusing on the US Department of Energy's C2M2 model that has become one of the most important tools for assessing the cybersecurity posture of organizations in the energy sector, and EPRI's technical assessment methodology that guides us, its users through a methodological process that effectively converges the assessment and mitigation activities. This webinar is a great start for the upcoming series of our webinars. If we can advance to the next slide, we will show you the upcoming webinars. I will not take your time by reading all the webinar titles, but I do encourage you to visit USEA website where you can register for the webinars that are of interest to you. Also remember that every Thursday for the next 9 weeks at around this time, we look forward to you joining us from the comfort of your home or office for an interesting discussion with a leading energy sector cybersecurity expert. That said, please note that the next webinar will start at 10 a.m. Washington, D.C. time, and our presenters will present on how to develop a utility cybersecurity strategy. With that, on behalf of USAID and USEA, I would like to thank our today's presenters and all of you for joining us today. And I pass the floor back to Johanna. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. So if you wish to register for our events, this is the website. And these are highlighted some of our previous cybersecurity webinars that we've conducted already. So as Jamila already mentioned, this is the first webinar in the second series of USAID Global Digitalization and Cybersecurity webinars, and builds on our previous 6, and then we'll go forward to the next. So we'll be a total of 15 webinars, I think. So now let me introduce our speakers. Galen Rache, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I meant to ask, sorry, at the beginning, is a Senior Program Manager in the Power Delivery and Utilization, PDU sector at the Electric Power Research Institute, managing the cybersecurity program P183. This program performs collaborative applied research to improve the security and resilience of transmission, distribution, and grid edge systems. In this position, Galen engages with cybersecurity teams and executives from electric power utilities around the world to develop cybersecurity technologies, standards, and business processes to address the emerging threats in the electric sector. He has 15 years of experience performing research in various aspects of cybersecurity and OT security. Christopher Taylor is a cybersecurity team lead in the Technology, Security, Strategy, and Architecture Department of Southern Company, with a focus on power delivery systems. The department is responsible for managing cybersecurity risk across the enterprise, including development of reference security architectures and engineering services. At Southern, he has spent the last 7 years focused on cybersecurity for power delivery and has led efforts on strategy development, technology deployment, and adoption of risk frameworks and assessments within the organizations. I will now hand the floor over to our first speaker, Galen. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Johanna. And thank you to USAID and USDA for the opportunity to present today. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Get my presentation up. All right. Can you see the presentation? Yes. Okay. All right. So good morning to everyone.
Sorry,
and afternoon
Galen,
or good evening.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. We can't see your screen. Can you try again?
Okay, let me try this.
I may have taken too long to get off.
Okay, that's all right. Let's see your screen two.
There we go. I think we're good now.
Okay, there we go. Okay, now can you see it?
No, yes, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that. I hadn't fully started sharing yet. So, okay, great. So yeah, good morning, everyone, and afternoon or evening, depending on where you are located. There again, appreciate the chance to speak with you today about cybersecurity assessments. This is an area that, in addition to our research, we've been leveraging different assessment tools and methodologies with our utility members for many years to help them develop security strategy, understand risk, and develop their cybersecurity roadmaps for their organization. So security assessments are really a critical component of any cybersecurity program, regardless of how large it is or how mature that particular program is. It's absolutely a key tool in the toolbox for determining where you are and where you want to be from a cybersecurity perspective. So before I get started, I want to give a little background about EPRI. If you're not familiar with EPRI, we were founded more than 40 years ago, specifically to conduct research and development for the electric sector. And so we have several research programs that focus on generation, including nuclear and fossil generation, power delivery, as well as the use of electricity and environmental issues related to the electric sector. And our members represent 90% of electricity generated and delivered in the US, but we also have a fairly sizable international component with members from almost 40 countries there. And so a few key things to remember about EPRI, though. If you look at the bottom right, there are really three, I think, unique characteristics for EPRI. First, we're independent, so we're not affiliated with any government institution, any companies. We don't make any products, so we're not a vendor. Also, we're a nonprofit, and so we're chartered to benefit the public. And finally, we focus on collaborative research. So we're mostly funded by utilities to perform collaborative applied research. And within the area of cybersecurity, we have research programs looking at security for nuclear plants, again, fossil generation plants, as well as power delivery systems. So we don't have a lot of time today to do deep dives into a lot of different types of assessments. And so I'm going to be giving just a high-level overview of two primary types of assessments, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, as well as EPRI's technical assessment methodology. And so what I want you to take away from this presentation is hopefully a better understanding of how those methodologies can be used, how they fit into your overall cybersecurity program, and how they can help you address risk. So again, cybersecurity assessments are really a core and critical part of your overall security program. and we've leveraged them many times with our members. You know, they help you understand, first of all, where are you now in terms of your capabilities, in terms of your security posture. You know, what it really takes you, they can take you through that current state assessment, but they can also be used to identify where you want to be. You know, what is the future state you're striving towards based on your particular risk tolerance and business objectives. And then based on that, you can determine how are you going to get there. So of course, once you know where you want to be and where you are now, you can perform that gap analysis and identify what are the required security capabilities needed to achieve that particular future state, and then develop your overall program roadmap and implementation plans to help you move from point A to point B. And so again, they're really a critical part of any cybersecurity program, but there's also a variety of assessments out there, and it can be a little bit confusing sometimes to know which type of assessment to use when, and what the real outcomes and goals are of the different kinds of assessments. So I'm going to start out giving a brief overview of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and then Christopher Taylor will be building on this more in the next presentation. So I'm just going to give a high-level perspective on it, kind of a foundational perspective on what it is and how it's used in the industry. So version 1 of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was actually published in 2014. Is driven by Executive Order 1636, improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Then an update to it, version 1.1, was published in 2018, and that's the current version of the framework. And since it's published, it's really been widely adopted, I think, in the US and internationally across not just the electric sector, but a variety of critical infrastructure sectors. And that was really the goal of it, was to develop something that's broadly applicable across different critical infrastructures. And so what the framework does, and I think this also gives it a unique spot in the assessment area, is it gives you a common taxonomy and mechanisms to describe what is your current cybersecurity posture, you know, develop and identify your target state for cybersecurity. It gives you enough detail to identify and prioritize what are your opportunities for improvement, assess your progress towards the target state. And also it's a great tool for communicating with both internal and external stakeholders about cybersecurity risk in your organization and how you're addressing that risk. And it's made up of three main parts, or I guess aspects, to the overall framework. The first one is the framework core. So that's on the kind of upper right side here. So the core is a set of cybersecurity activities, desired outcomes, and references, or applicable references that are common across critical infrastructure sectors. And when most people think of the framework itself, they're probably thinking of this core area. And so I'll be going into more detail about what makes up the framework core in the next few slides. The next component of the framework is what's called the implementation tiers. And so these tiers provide or give you context about how your organization views cybersecurity risk and the processes that are in place to manage that risk. And the tiers are written in a way that look a little bit at the maturity of those processes, but the implementation tiers are actually not, I guess, maturity levels in the formal definition of a maturity model there, but they can, again, just be a way to assess your risk management program processes, and also how you leverage external organizations for analyzing your risk. And then the third area on the upper left is the framework profile. And this is also a very important part of the overall NIST Cybersecurity Framework, because the profile is your tool for aligning all the functions, categories, and subcategories that are in the framework core with your business requirements, risk tolerance, and the resources of your organization. And so it really represents, the outcomes that you want to achieve, the security outcomes based on your business needs that you have selected from the framework categories and subcategories. So what's interesting about the framework is, that focuses on these outcomes, but also gives you the flexibility to prioritize and select the particular categories and subcategories that are most applicable to your organization there. So you don't have to do everything in the framework, but use these profiles to narrow that down to what is most important to you, and again, what aligns with your risk tolerance, resources, and business requirements. And so the profiles can be used to identify these opportunities for improvement by comparing your current profile. So that's where you go in and see, okay, which subcategory outcomes are you meeting currently with your target profile, the future state. So that's where you go see, okay, here's where we want to be, here are the outcomes that we need to achieve to address the cybersecurity risk for our organization. And so by leveraging your current profile and your target profile, that's how you can do your gap analysis and start to prioritize your security investments and develop a roadmap on where you want to be. So these are the three kind of core components to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Again, the framework core is probably what most people think of when they think of the framework. And so I'll give a little more background on those areas. So within the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, there's basically 5 functions. And these functions are meant to be continuous and concurrent functions that give you a high-level strategic view of how your organization manages cybersecurity risk. So they identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And another thing that I like about the framework is the way it calls out the outcomes within the identify function. I mean, generally, most security people are familiar with the cycle of protect, detect, respond, recover. But within identify, if you look at the categories that are in there, these are actually the processes and outcomes that are very foundational to a security program. Things like asset management, knowing what you have, what you're trying to protect, configuration management, as well as governance activities, risk assessment, supply chain management, risk management strategy, et cetera. So the identify function actually has a lot of very foundational security activities here that don't show up in the normal protect, detect, respond, recover. But as you go down, through the other functions, I think they're fairly self-explanatory. In terms of protect is how you actually develop and implement the safeguards for protecting the critical infrastructure services that you're supplying. Detect, do you have the right activities to identify when a cyber event or incident is occurring? Respond, that's how all of the activities that drive how you actually take action once you have detected a cybersecurity event. And finally, in the recover function, that's where you identify the right activities and the plans to maintain resilience or to do any restoration that you need to do to restore any functions that were impaired due to a cybersecurity event. So again, the functions are just this high-level strategic view of and categories of different activities that are leveraged to manage cybersecurity risk. Within each function, there are several categories, as you'd see from the previous slide, and there's a lot here, but these categories can also help you, I guess, think about basic security questions that you may be asking or your management may be asking you about your security program. Things like, how should the program be organized? How do you assess the effectiveness of your program? Are you accurately assessing the risk for your organization, for all parts of your organization, IT and OT? Looking at supply chain security, which is a very hot topic now. Do you trust the equipment that you're deploying in the field? And are you also looking at potential risks from third-party service providers that may be connecting to your systems? Are you managing or doing your identity access management correctly? Are you managing your passwords, and remote access to field devices in the most secure way? Do you have the right architectures to protect your OT systems? Also, this is a very interesting topic. Do you have the right visibility into your OT networks and devices to even know if an event is occurring? That's a very challenging topic there. And also, are the tools that you're using to do the detection appropriate for OT systems? Are they configured correctly? Do they understand the protocols? And then looking at how you respond and recover, for example, do your SCADA operators, are they trained to know how to identify and respond to cyber attacks? And also, do you have the right forensics tools to do root cause analysis and determine which of your devices have been compromised? And so these are very common questions related to a security program, and you can relate these back to these categories. And within each category, there are several subcategories as well. And so the subcategories really get down into the much more specific security outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And I think a nice feature of the way that the framework was developed is for each subcategory security outcome, they identified several informative references that can help you address or achieve that particular security outcome. And so different organizations use different references, and so it's great to see this mapped across a variety of international standards, catalogs, and approaches. So if you use ISA 62443, maybe you're doing the ISO 27001, or you like to use NIST 853, you can look for each subcategory and outcome and go and check out those informative references. And if you're already implementing those, then it's easy to give yourself credit for that particular security outcome there. And so, I think that's very nice to not have to go do that mapping yourself. And again, depending on where you are in the world, you may use a particular standard or approach for this. So there's several benefits to, I think, to leveraging the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. For one, the 5 functions are very easy for non-security staff and executives to understand. When you say identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, most people can understand what those mean there and why they're important to cybersecurity. Also, it is widely adopted in the industry. Again, it's leveraged, I think, in the U.S. as well as around the world, but also across multiple critical infrastructures. It also focuses on outcomes, which gives you flexibility and implementation to achieve those outcomes. There's references available in terms of profiles, and again, it can be tied and mapped back to a variety of different international standards and catalogs there. But there are some challenges with it. There's not a generally accepted scoring mechanism like you see with some other assessment tools. So it's more like binary yes or no. So sometimes it makes it a little more difficult to track your progress to achieving outcomes. The control sets within it, if you really go look at the references, some of them are at different levels of specificity and a mixture of technical organizational controls there. Also, as I mentioned, the different tiers are not really a formal maturity model there. But also, I think a key aspect of this is you really need to have good OT cybersecurity expertise to apply this correctly. Most utilities I see leverage the framework. They don't just apply it across an entire organization. They might do an assessment for their corporate IT domain, then maybe a different one for generation, a different one for transmission, different one for distribution. And that helps reflect the different business drivers, objectives, and risks related to each of those areas. But to do that properly, you really do need to make sure you have the right OT expertise involved in that. So I included some basic cybersecurity or the cybersecurity framework resources on this slide. So when the slides are distributed, these are clickable links, so you can go grab the framework version 1.1. I also included links to 3 industry profiles that are available, and I highly recommend taking a look at those and reading through them. You can see how they identified their key security objectives and business objectives within those profiles. And then also the last link is very interesting because it's an actual implementation guide that's tied to the Cybersecurity Framework Manufacturing Profile, which is also a very useful resource there. So as a very brief overview of this cybersecurity framework, again, it's I think a very useful, easy to leverage tool to identify and look at cybersecurity outcomes that are most important to your organization or to different parts of your organization, and do a gap analysis and develop a roadmap to implement the capabilities that are your highest priority. The second assessment methodology I want to go over today was one that's developed by EPRI. It's called the Technical Assessment Methodology, or the TAM. And so the EPRI TAM is a different type of assessment. It's actually focused more on developing the right security controls for a particular system. So it helps you identify vulnerabilities and develop the specific controls necessary to help you mitigate risk on a specific system. So it was developed first in 2015. It originally focused on nuclear sector assets. It's developed in collaboration with domestic and international utilities, as well as some national labs in the US. And the real purpose of it is to give you an actionable, risk-informed, systems engineer-based approach to help you analyze your systems and components, identify what are the actual vulnerabilities within the system, how can it be attacked in very specific terms, and then also how can you mitigate those vulnerabilities to an acceptable risk level by identifying and implementing the most effective control measures. And so it's this repeatable process that steps you through achieving these goals for a specific system. So let's say, for example, that you are purchasing, deploying, or assessing an energy storage system, just as an example. The TAM helps you break that system down into the subsystems and components you're most interested in, helps you score the risk associated with that system, as well as the actual control measures you want to implement. It can be used during the procurement process, or to analyze equipment that's already installed, and gives you, again, a repeatable process for identifying those vulnerabilities, identifying the mitigations, and tracking if there are any unmitigated vulnerabilities as well. And it helps identify what parties are actually responsible for those mitigations. And there are 3 steps in this process. The first one helps you characterize the system, understand the attack surface, and identify the exploit sequences the attacker may use. Step 2 then is where you actually identify, score, and allocate the engineered security control methods. So first we identify potential vulnerabilities and exploit sequences, then we identify the right control methods to address them. And then step 3 is where you can look at and address, are there any residual risks or vulnerabilities that have not been addressed yet that might be able to be addressed by different shared controls there. And one of the outputs of this process is what we call a cybersecurity data sheet, which, if you're familiar with the material safety data sheet, is kind of based on that concept, where you'd have a standard template that could be used for doing these types of assessments. And you can basically use the same template over and over again. And so there are 2 parts to the cybersecurity data sheet, which align with step 1 and step 2 of the assessment methodology. So step 1 is your attack surface characterization. So that's where you specify what is the scope of your assessment, what's in, what's out, how much are you decomposing the system, your target asset characteristics, what's the data you're trying to protect, data at rest, data in transit. Also, what are the data paths in the system? How is data generated? Where is it flowing to within the system? And how important is that data? What are potential impacts if that data is altered, for example? So part 1A and 1B is where you have your engineering hat on, analyzing the system. Part 1C and 1D, you actually put on your hacker hat, your attacker hat, and then think about, okay, what are the attack pathways? What is the attack surface? What are the attack vectors for this system? Those are things like direct physical access, logical access, supply chain, portable media, ways an attacker can touch the system. And then the pathways are what's actually used by an adversary to take action against that asset. So they leverage the attack vector, but attack pathways go beyond that to actually show how they take action against the asset. And the exploit sequences, those are made up, that process involves identifying exploit mechanisms, specific actions that must occur for an attacker to achieve an exploit objective. So the exploit sequence is actually a combination of what's the attacker trying to achieve, what are the pathways that you've already identified that they would need to leverage for that, and then the exploit mechanisms that they would need to use to achieve that, that overall exploit sequence there. So very thorough analysis there. And in part two, now that you've done the analysis, that's where you go in and you actually identify the right security controls for addressing those vulnerabilities and exploit sequences. And you not just identify them, but you actually score them in terms of how effective they are at reducing risk, what is the burden of implementing them, you know, understand the efficacy of those controls, and then you allocate those controls. And the output of the process, there are actually three outputs. The first is the cybersecurity data sheet. And then the second two outputs are related to step 3 in the TAM process. And you may recall step 3 is where you look at, are there any residual vulnerabilities, any residual exploit sequences that have not been addressed yet? And so here, this is where you identify what are the shared technical control methods that you can use. So these are, you know, methods that are basically inherited, you know, by the system that you can use to score and basically get credit for. And then the relationship sets help you map those shared control methods to the specific exploit sequences that are still left in the system and that you're trying to address. So I know that's a lot of information there about how this methodology works. But again, I think what your key takeaway from that should be is really understanding that it's a very thorough methodology. It's a repeatable methodology, and it really steps you through this entire process here. And so I've provided on this slide some additional references and resources for the technical assessment methodology. Again, this is basically, it's an engineering process, and the goal is to not try to put an entire catalog of security controls on a system, but to really analyze it, understand potential attack pathways, your attack surface, and make sure you're only allocating the controls that are necessary to address those risks and attack and exploit sequences. And so it's also modular. So if you want to use it for a system like an energy storage system, or you can use it for a relay or a smart inverter, for example, you can take it down to any of those levels there to do that analysis. And so it's modular, which also makes it scalable. But I think what's also important is that it's a very standardized process. It's repeatable. And once you get familiar with it, you know, then you can, of course, do it more quickly and leverage your prior assessments as well, and leverage prior cybersecurity data sheets, you know, as you're assessing additional systems. So I know there's a fair amount of information there that I covered, but again, I just wanted to give you a high-level perspective of two assessment approaches. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which focuses on security outcomes, can be leveraged to identify where your organization is now and where it wants to be from that security outcome perspective to help manage risk, and also taking into account your key business drivers and resources. And then also the other tool that you need to be able to use is this technical assessment methodology, which then takes it down to an actual system, subsystem, or component level to really identify those specific security control methods that you need to secure a system there. And so this is my contact information. If you have any additional questions, I'd be happy to, you can email me, I'd be happy to answer them, or we'll answer them later on after the presentations are done. So with that, I think I can hand it back to you, Johanna.
Thank you. Thank you. That was super interesting. Next, we'll have Christopher Taylor from Southern Company. Christopher, if you want to put up your presentation. Perfect. We can see it.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Joanna and Jamila for the introduction. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, or C2M2. Earlier, Galen provided a great overview of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework during his presentation. I'd like to build on that a little bit and provide an overview of C2M2, its history, and how it can be used to implement the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So what is C2M2? C2M2 was developed in partnership between the Department of Energy and U.S. utilities in 2012 with a minor refresh in 2014. The model provides a voluntary model that an organization can use to build, maintain, and mature a cybersecurity program. It has a few key objectives. It can help an organization strengthen its cybersecurity capabilities. It provides a consistent assessment methodology which allows for benchmarking, internal, external. It also provides for tracking to see how you progress over time in a utility. It facilitates sharing of best practices by providing a common taxonomy for how to talk about cybersecurity. And finally, it really helps an organization prioritize their cyber gaps that need to be addressed and associated investments that go along with those gaps. It's gained widespread use in the energy sector and other sectors over the last several years. And while it is getting a little long in the tooth, you know, it developed in 2012. A update to the model is currently being developed and is expected to be released in 2021. So now that we have C2M2, what is a maturity model? Let's talk about that a little bit. It's really an organized way to identify competencies and areas of improvement. It evaluates an organization's practices, their processes, and their procedures, and your maturity progression. So unlike some frameworks or models, it's really looking at an organization and the activities it does, not necessarily systems. It's not very prescriptive telling you how to do it. It's more telling you the types of things you should be considering and are you doing those things, not how to do those things. So what does that look like? So if you look on the slide here, you see that you have different types of building blocks. So you have the Duplos, which are the big blocks for kids. They're not very complicated. You may be, you know, building with that. You may not have any instructions. You're building stuff as a little kid. And as you get more mature, you start getting plans for those Legos. The blocks get smaller. You get more pieces. So you're starting to build things that are useful. And then, you know, as you really progress, you get to building robots and maybe have thousands of pieces as part of your Lego set. And that's the maturity of building with the children's toys. So translating that to cybersecurity, let's look at authentication. Maybe you have passwords to start. You know, you actually have to have a password to log on your device. Then you have strong passwords. Then maybe you're changing those passwords on a regular basis, maybe every 60 days. Then you start to add two-factor authentication or three-factor authentication. That's the corollary for cybersecurity. So that's how the maturity model works as you go through your progressions. So looking at the C2M2's architecture, C2M2 is composed of 10 model domains. And did my thing freeze? There it goes. It froze for a second there. So C2M2 is composed of 10 model domains. These domains are logical groupings of security practices that protect operations from cyber-related disruptions. So first, I'd like to point out the two domains on each end of this slide. From the cyber perspective, I like to look at these as the bookends or the foundations for building a mature cyber program and organization. The first domain on the left is risk management. This domain identifies, analyzes, and mitigates cybersecurity risk for the organization, including its business units, its subsidiaries, and related interconnected infrastructure and stakeholders. Then on the right, you have cybersecurity program management, which helps you establish and maintain an enterprise cybersecurity program that provides governance, strategic planning, and sponsorship for the organization's cybersecurity activities in a manner that aligns with your cybersecurity objectives. These are the key pieces for doing cybersecurity within an organization. Then in between, you have asset change and configuration management, which manages the organization's IT and OT assets, including both hardware and software. You have identity and access management, which helps you create and manage identities for entities that may be granted logical or physical access to the organization's assets. Threat and vulnerability management. This provides the plans, procedures, and technologies to detect, identify, analyze, manage, and respond to cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. Situational awareness. This is activities and technologies to collect, analyze, to alarm, and use operational cybersecurity information to help you have a greater understanding of your organization's operational and cybersecurity states. You have information sharing communications. This is maybe partnering with other utilities, your government, even within organizations across your company. And how do you share information to improve your cybersecurity posture? Incident response and continuity of operations. These are the plans and procedures and technologies that you use to detect, respond, and recover from cybersecurity events and incidents. Gayla mentioned supply chain a little bit earlier. These are some of the controls that you can use to manage cybersecurity risk associated with services and assets that are dependent on external entities. Finally, you have workforce management. These are the plans, procedures, and technologies that create a culture of cybersecurity within your organization. And what are you doing to make sure that you have suitable and competent personnel working on cybersecurity? So as you go through an assessment, each domain will come out with a maturity level or a maturity indicator level, ranging from a level 0, which is where we're really not performing any cybersecurity practices in a domain, to a level 3, which is very advanced practices. And you'll get these scores by going through a progression of 312 practices from MIL 1 to MIL 3. And at MIL 1, you're going to have 51 practices. And these are the basic practices that you should be doing from a cybersecurity organization. These are your starting point. They're really the building blocks for starting to do cybersecurity within your organization. And then there'll also be another 260 or so MIL 2 and MIL 3 practices that are progressively more advanced that a company should strive for based on their risk environment and their risk tolerance. So now that we've discussed the model's architectures, let's look at the scoring model. This really is key for conducting your assessment and making sure you get consistent results as you go through an assessment. So you're going to have 4 types of answers for each of the practices within C2M2. The first and the last one are the easiest. So the first, if a control is not implemented, that means you're just not doing it in the organization. That's a real easy one to answer. Or fully implemented. This means that the practice is being described as performed in the model. In between, it gets a little more difficult to choose between largely implemented and partially implemented. But the way the model describes it, partially implemented is you're doing some things in that area, but there's multiple areas for improvement that are material to achieving your cybersecurity objectives. And then largely implemented means you're mostly doing it. It's performed substantially as described in the model. It doesn't have a huge impact on achieving your goals, but there's some room for improvement in that area. Maybe some optimization, maybe a few devices that aren't included within the practice, but a majority is within your organization. So what I want to do here is kind of look through one objective within one domain and show that progression. So this shows an objective of controlling access within the identity and access management domain. As we look through the practices, we can see as we move through the maturity levels, the practices build upon themselves and become more difficult to achieve. So in MIL 1, to control access, the model is looking for access to be granted based on requirements. Notice they don't describe or prescribe what requirements should be used. Then in MIL 2, it gets a little more difficult. Those requirements should include things like cyber best practices like least privilege or separation of duties. And then in MIL 3, you're granting that access based on risk to the function or the organization, which means that you will have to have looked at your risk and understand that risk to be able to base it on that risk. So that gets a little bit more difficult. So once you've now completed an assessment, gone through your 300 and so controls or so, what are your results like? What do you get as a output? So this is something that a lot of people refer to as the 30 circles or the donuts. You see you have a score, actually 3 scores for each domain. So let's look at the risk domain, risk management domain on the far left. So in the risk management domain, there's 24 practices, and at mill level, there's only 2 of those. So here you can see that the organization was fully implemented for those two controls. As you move into mill 2, you'll see that there's 13 controls. Now this includes the 2 controls at mill 1 plus 11 new practices at mill 2. And so there are 2 that are not implemented and the rest are implemented. And then at mill 3, it again includes the 13 mill 1 and mill 2 controls and another 11 controls. So this organization is assigned a mill level 1 for risk management because the only thing that is fully completed is the mill 1 controls. Conversely, looking at the threat one, which is the 4th set of donuts in from the left, you'll see that this is assigned to mill 3, but there's some light green in there too. So from assigning a mill level, maturity level, largely implemented counts for satisfying those activities. So here you can see that there are some gaps in the organization, but they're largely implemented, at least are largely implemented on all those controls. So here you have a mill 3 domain. A little bit complicated, a little bit difficult, and that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about using C2M2 to implement the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, because I think things get a little easier when you start to talk about things in terms of the framework instead of C2M2. So now that we've talked about C2M2, let's look at how to use C2M2 to implement this NIST Cybersecurity Framework and why. So in 2013, President Obama issued an executive order that Galen mentioned earlier that directed the development of a technology-neutral cybersecurity framework, and it directed sector coordinating councils to develop guidance to address sector-specific risk. In response, the energy sector and the Department of Energy developed implementation guidance, which was published in 2015. It provided guidance for our sector on how to adopt the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and detailed how to implement the framework using C2M2. So how do you go about implementing the NIST framework using C2M2? First off, it's essential to use a model like C2M2 to implement the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, because in reality, this CSF does not provide an assessment methodology or scoring guidance, which are both provided by C2M2. But then why don't we just use C2M2? Why do we need the NIST Cybersecurity Framework? Well, while C2M2 is excellent for a cybersecurity professional to look at detailed technical and maturity considerations, and it provides that scoring, it provides how to measure your progress, it's not an easy model for non-cyber personnel or executives to understand. So it's quite common to see C2M2 results translated to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's effective because the framework buckets, as Galen mentioned, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. They're easy to understand. They provide effective communication. And this translation can either be done on your own through mapping provided in the implementation guidance, or there's several vendors, which I'll mention 1 or 2 that provide this capability. I don't want to spend too much time on the technical details of this slide, but I wanted to show that the DOE implementation guidance does provide control mapping from C2M2 to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So a couple key points to note here is that C2M2 maps to the entire NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It is a superset, and it's more encompassing than the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. The one sticky area for the model is the cyber architecture. Mapping is tricky here. C2M2 doesn't get into this very much because it doesn't want to be too prescriptive on how to do things. But I will say that this is being addressed in version 2, which is due out next year. And then another key point here is that mapping is not one-to-one. It's many-to-many, and so a NIST Cybersecurity Framework subcategory may map to multiple C2M2 practices and vice versa. So on this slide, I really want to go through and talk through the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 7-step cycle for implementation and how to use C2M2 to do that. So the first step is to prioritize and scope, and this is one of the most important steps of the whole assessment. If you provide too small of a scope, it's unmanageable. You can't do enough assessments within your organization to make it useful. You have too much, you have data overload. It's just not effective. If it's too large and then your results become watered down, if you do it for all the organization, you're going to find that you get a lot of largely or partially implemented, and you're just not going to get a good idea of where to make your investments. So you really want to find that sweet spot. So as Galen mentioned, that might be generation, it might be transmission. If you're a really big company, it might be an operating company's transmission or an operating company's generation or distribution. So once you've decided on that scope, you want to orient. You want to identify the necessary subject matter experts. You know, make sure you have distribution people in there if you're assessing distribution. Make sure you have the right cyber people. Understand the scope. Understand what the function of that organization you're looking at. What applications are in scope? What systems are in scope? You know, what are the dependencies? Make sure you orient and understand what's going on in that environment before you assess it. The third step is creating a current profile. This is where you conduct your C2M2 assessment. And then you conduct a risk assessment. This is really just evaluating the results of your C2M2 assessment. And then creating a target profile. And I'm going to talk about a target profile a little bit more on another side, but this is based on your results and your risk appetite and where you think you can get to. Where, you know, what is your risk? What resources do you have to put in to address that risk? And you look at that, and then you build your C2M2 profile based on that. And then in step 6, you are prioritizing your access plan to achieve your target profile. And in step 7, you are implementing that action plan, and you can use tools like C2M2, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and other stuff to figure out how to best implement that action plan. And then most importantly is your repeat. What is the right tempo? Is this a year? Is it 2 years? You want to make sure you have enough time to go in, do an assessment, develop that action plan, implement some of those things before you go back and assess again and measure where you're at. So a lot of times I get from small utilities or people that are just starting to do C2M2 for the first time, and they say, where do I start? This is a big assessment. There's a lot of controls. We've never really looked at C2M2. Where should we start? As I mentioned in an earlier slide, there's 51 C2M2 MIL practices, and that's a great place to start. Make sure you're doing the absolute basics, the cyber hygiene that goes along with cybersecurity. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can go through the assessment, the DOE model, and just look at those controls. Or there is a free option through Axio.com. They offer a free rapid start MIL 1 assessment, and you can go to their website and do your assessment that way. And then as you get more mature and you're building that target profile, I want to look at this slide for a little bit, and you could spend an entire presentation just talking about target profiles and risk. So I'm only going to touch on this slide a little bit. So if you look at the top curve on this slide, you're going to see that when you're at a lower maturity level and you invest in security, you're going to realize a really high payoff in risk reduction for your investment. And what you're going to see as you become more mature, your payoff's going to flatten. The capability increases those capability increases will cost more. This means it's going to be really much easier for you to go from a MIL 0 to a MIL 1 or a MIL 1 to a MIL 2 than really starting to get close up those circles and get from a MIL 2 to MIL 3. It gets really, really difficult. And the second curve addresses risk transfer, which, like I said, is an entire other topic for a presentation. But what you see here is that there are opportunities potentially to decrease risk through risk transfer, such as insurance or other transfer activities. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, I mentioned earlier, C2M2 version 2 is under development. It's expected to be released early next year. Couple things that it's looking to achieve. It is adding a cybersecurity architecture domain to address creation and maintenance of secure technology environments. It's going to remove the information sharing communication domain. Doesn't mean that these activities aren't important. Those activities are going to be scattered out among situational awareness and threat and vulnerability management. There just wasn't quite enough here to justify it being its own domain. And one of the other reasons we're doing that is 10 domains and about 300 controls is the right amount. One of the goals of C2M2 is for it to be able to be completed in one day, 6 to 8 hours. And if you start to add too many controls, the assessment can spread over multiple days, and it's just not as effective of a tool to be if it's done in more than one day. And then a couple other things. Right now, the model, the first draft is complete and it's undergoing technical sweeps. So what they're doing is they're looking at either emerging technologies, recently identified threats, and going through and making sure the model provides coverage for those types of things. And the other thing that they're going to do is the C2M2 toolkit is very long in the tooth. It has some issues running on modern versions of Microsoft Office. So they are going to come up with an improved toolkit that should be a lot easier to use. And that's really what I wanted to leave you with. Here are some C2M2 resources. Department of Energy and NIST. This provides the model. It provides the implementation guidance. It also provides the NIST framework. And then the last two links at the bottom here are Axio and Facility Cybersecurity Light Assessment. These are some free resources that you can use to help you facilitate your first C2M2 assessment. And I want to thank USAID and USAID for their time and the opportunity to come talk to you guys today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. That was very good. So now I'm going to pull up my screen just for question and answer session. Okay. And I just realized I can't see that. Yes, I can. Okay. So I just posted just now when somebody asked in the question and answer session. I'm not sure if people can see those questions and answers or if they just go straight to us. So I posted, Galen posted the link to the EPRI TAM document. I just pasted that into the chat for anybody who's interested. And I also got another question that I will start off with. It's maybe not the best question to start because it's very specific. And I frankly don't understand it. I asked for clarification. I haven't gotten that yet. The question is, how do you see the recent move on strengthening Quad-related discussion from an ASEAN viewpoint? So ASEAN being Southeast Asia. But I personally don't know what the Quad-related discussion is. Do either of you know what that is? Would you be able to answer that question, or do we need to wait for clarification on that?
And I'm going to have to plead ignorance to that one and get a little more clarification.
I don't know what that is either.
Same here.
Okay, all right. Well, let's go to the other questions then. Okay. If you could go a little bit over whose responsibilities is it within the organization to conduct these assessments? time-wise, you were saying that the assessment should take 6 to 8 hours? And then who
for C2M2, yes. But for who should conduct them, and that may be dependent on the organization. If you have an organization that has a cybersecurity program, a cybersecurity team, they're probably going to be the team that is responsible for conducting those assessments. Now, developing action plans and how to do that within the business may have many stakeholders within the business outside of the cybersecurity organization. As you get into a smaller utility or a utility that's never really stood this up, this may start more organically within an operations organization. Some of the smaller utilities that I've met with here in the U.S., they may have an operator that has cybersecurity responsibilities, and so they may be the ones who kick off that assessment that may end up leading to the development of people with just cybersecurity responsibilities. But I think that's going to be dependent on the organization.
On the size of the organization.
Yep.
And did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think for the I was going to say, I think for the technical assessment methodology, since that's very system dependent or subsystem dependent, it's typically a security architect or security engineer that might be brought in as part of a project to do that type of analysis and review, working with the system owner, system designers as well to complete that process. So it's a little bit lower level, I think, than what's driven with the cybersecurity framework and the C2M2.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question, another one. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I didn't mention we have a webinar poll in progress. I would really appreciate everyone if you could answer. That really helps us with our programming and evaluating and developing our programming. Thank you. So the question is, can utilities themselves use these frameworks to assess their level of cybersecurity capability, or would they require third-party help? So you've covered that a little bit already, actually. That kind of those two questions were different ways of asking the same question, I guess, basically. But you want to elaborate that on a little bit more?
Yeah, I can elaborate a little bit on that. So I think the easy way to do it is to bring in a third party. You have people that are trained on this. They may have tools that help it, but all the materials that you need in that in the C2M2 model and then within the implementation guide, I think are there for an organization to do it, especially if you're tight on resources. And as I mentioned, Axio and PNNL with their C2M2s. I think actually on Axio you can do a full C2M2 assessment within their tool. So there are some free resources out there that you can do if you're constrained by budget. But one of the challenges there, if you do it yourself, is sometimes groups are a little more open with a third party than they are with the cybersecurity team. So we found when we do internal assessments, we maybe get more candid conversation by bringing a third party than someone that they have to work with all the time. So it definitely can be done either way, and a lot of that's going to depend on your organization. There's a lot of options out there.
Okay. Could you, I would think would be useful maybe to go over the relationship between the NIST standards, C2M2 and TAM, how they interrelate, because we've had some questions about that.
Sure, I can go over that really quickly. And yeah, I know it's a little complicated when you're looking at several different assessments to know exactly how they all fit in and the benefits of each there. And fortunately, I think each of these actually have a role that they play in an organization. With the NIST framework, it's focused on, again, cybersecurity outcomes and aligning those outcomes that you want to achieve with your own risk tolerance and business objectives and resources. So since it's outcomes, it's not prescriptive. It says, here's an outcome that you have set as a priority. You look at, determine how you want to achieve that. And that's where those informative references are very useful. Because if you use ISO 27001, or if you use 853 or ISA, controls, approaches, they've already mapped those within the framework to show how you can achieve certain outcomes. Whereas the technical assessment methodology is more on identifying the correct security controls, which is different than an outcome. It's really looking at doing your risk assessment properly, identifying the risk vulnerabilities, and then developing the minimum set of controls that help you mitigate risk for a specific system or device or something like that. So it's really on a kind of a different level than the framework and the C2M2, but both are necessary because both, there are situations where you basically need to do one assessment or the other there. But I'd say that's the main difference. Is cybersecurity framework is focused on outcomes. TAM is focused on identifying engineered controls to mitigate the risk for a specific system.
Well, I'll ask the next question, which is very much related to this division of responsibilities here. What do you think about not using NIST, but using ISO 27001 framework in the maturity model? I don't know if either of you are that familiar.
Yeah, so in the U.S., C2M2 is the DOE's selected model for doing cybersecurity assessments and maturity models. There is nothing wrong with 2700. It has a little more European flavor, but I don't think that there's a wrong answer there. I think C2M2 is a great tool to facilitate discussion within your organization. We get a lot of value just going through the assessments because it helps our business partners, our stakeholders understand why we ask the questions we do, why we ask them to do the things we do within cybersecurity. But that doesn't mean using another framework you couldn't get those same goals. That's just what I'm familiar with and has been very effective for our company.
Mm-hmm.
And just a plug for future webinars, we will be talking about ISO standards and certification in a future webinar. And we have another question here. How does a utility ensure that relevant employees really keep the integrity of a company's security? For example, not selling your security protocol or sensitive data. Or is there anything, or is that more of a regulatory issue? Is there anything you can do security-wise?
Alan, you want to go first, or you want me to take this one?
So I was just reading over the question again. Really keeps the integrity of the company security. So was that tied to legal framework in the country? Okay. Well, essentially that kind of ties in with a couple of things, like how you do your insider threat program, since it's looking at employee there, but I think certainly it's tied to the legal framework in the country in terms of what are the ramifications if someone is caught doing that, which ties into your deterrence efforts within the utility. They ask, should you rotate employees? I mean, that's certainly a common security approach. Is employee rotation, separation of duties. Some of those kind of basic functions as well can help with some of those insider threat scenarios there.
Yeah. To echo Galen, insider threat is one of the biggest threats to industry from a cybersecurity perspective, either through malicious actions or through just mistakes, user error. So Galen mentioned a lot of the right things there. Having an insider threat program. He didn't shamelessly plug the fact that EPRI is running a project on insider threat right now for OT environments, which I'm impressed at. But EPRI is doing a lot of research in that area. But then best cyber hygiene practices of separation of duties, rotating people, and that's all got to be. Those decisions have to be made based on the risk of the information that those people are handling.
There's also, I think, ways that you can pinpoint where those, where leaks came from. And having systems in place that can do that, I guess, would be a good deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay. I'm not sure if we have any other questions. Let me see. We have another question, which is, should the outcome of these assessments, how widely should they be shared and with whom? Should it be restricted to the utility management only?
So I think there's two pieces there. So one of the interesting things about C2M2, like I mentioned earlier, it's looking at organizational practices, maturities. It's not getting into specific vulnerabilities or capability gaps on systems. So I think C2M2, the way they're done, can maybe be shared a little bit more broadly. I think the cybersecurity practitioner needs those results, right? They need to know where the gaps are if they're going to help develop solutions to address those. And then, you know, management is going to need to see that. So I would say it's sensitive, but I don't know if it's critically sensitive data from a C2M2 perspective. Now, if you're doing a 853 assessment, if you're looking at a specific system and looking at security vulnerabilities, looking at gaps in your architecture, those are things you're going to want to keep much more close hold.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Galen, did you have something you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, sure. I'd agree with that, especially the last part as it relates to something like the technical assessment methodology, because that is such a detailed analysis of your attack surface and vulnerabilities for the system. Then that's certainly information that you'd want to keep close hold on there.
Okay, great. Actually, there's another question I missed, which is what do you deploy first? NIST CSF or C2M2?
So they as we kind of described, they kind of go hand in hand. So it is possible to just do a NIST CSF assessment. You can do that. The challenge with that is, like I said, there's not an assessment methodology and there's not a scoring framework. So if you're using a third party, there are third parties out there that will just do NIST CSF assessments for you, and they've developed that scoring mechanism. So that's definitely an option. You can do it that way. If you're doing it yourself, though, I'd really look at C2M2, because there's just not a better assessment out there that I've seen that has the guidance, the implementation guidance, the supporting help text on doing an assessment and helping you through that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Galen, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's hard to say like which one is first, because you could say we're starting with the framework, but then the C2M2 is how you're achieving the outcomes within that framework. So they may not necessarily be separated quite that way. Yeah. There. So. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap up with this. There are no more questions, and we are well over our hour. But thank you very much to both of our panelists, and thank you to USAID for helping us to organize this event, making it possible. And last but not least, definitely thank you to our inquisitive audience with lots of questions, and please join us for the rest of this series.